Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that I think is often misunderstood. It's the history of Africa before European colonization. And we have some pretty incredible sources, actually, that paint a picture of this really vibrant and complex world that existed long before the European powers entered the scene.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have this kind of idea of Africa as like a homogenous continent with no real history prior to, European contact.
Right.
But that couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah.
So we're going to be looking specifically at three West African empires, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And these were major players. I mean, they had organized governments, these bustling trade networks, and fascinating social structures.
Yeah. We're talking about empires that rivaled any of the major powers in Europe at the time, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, but one of the things that really stood out to me in these sources, when I was going through them, was the mention of slavery. And I think it's really important to understand that slavery existed in Africa long before the arrival of Arab or European traders. But it was a completely different system than what we might typically imagine.
You're absolutely right. That's a really critical distinction to make, because the transatlantic slave trade casts such a long shadow over, our understanding of slavery as a whole. Right. In these West African empires, slavery was deeply integrated into the social and economic fabric, but it operated under a completely different set of rules and customs. For example, you might be surprised to learn that slaves in these societies could actually hold positions of power and influence.
Okay, wait. Hold on a second. Slaves holding positions of power. Help me understand that, because that seems to contradict everything I thought I knew about slavery.
I know it's kind of mind-blowing when you first encounter it, right? But the sources detail instances of slaves becoming military generals or even serving as advisors to emperors. There's even a fascinating example of the Dian Sandi, or chiefs of slaves.
Okay.
And they held significant authority within these empires. And in one instance, a Dian Sandi actually managed to usurp an emperor's throne.
Wow, that's incredible.
Talk about shaking up the power structure.
Yeah. So it sounds like traditional African slavery wasn't just about, ownership, but it was a much more nuanced system with its own rules and even avenues for social mobility. I mean, that's a far cry from the chattel slavery that emerged later on.
Exactly. And to understand that nuance, I think we need to look at the different categories of slaves that existed within these empires. There were state-owned slaves, privately owned slaves, and even those born into slavery.
Right. And
the specific roles and responsibilities of slaves varied, depending on their category.
Okay, so even within the broad category of quote-unquote slave, there were further distinctions based on their status and roles within society.
Exactly.
Can you give me a specific example of how these different categories might have played out in daily life?
Sure. Well, let's take the example of a state-owned slave versus a privately owned slave.
Okay.
A state-owned slave might work on large agricultural projects or in the military, essentially serving the needs of the empire as a whole. On the other hand, a privately owned slave might work within a household, tending to domestic tasks or managing a family's business. And it's important to note that the treatment of slaves could vary greatly depending on their owner and their specific roles.
It's fascinating to consider how kinship structures might have impacted the treatment of slaves. The sources mention the importance of, matrilineal and patrilineal descent systems in these societies.
Right.
Can you explain how those systems might have influenced the lives of slaves?
Absolutely. In societies with matrilineal descent, lineage and inheritance were traced through the mother's side of the family.
Okay.
This meant that a slave who belonged to a mother's household held a different status than a slave who belonged to a father's household. It could affect everything from their, from their work responsibilities to their potential for inheritance, or even their ability to marry.
Okay, so just to clarify for our listener, in a matrilineal society, a slave owned by a woman might actually have more opportunities or a higher social standing than a slave owned by a man.
Exactly. And the reverse would be true in a patrilineal society where lineage is traced through the father's line.
Right.
These kinship systems had a very real impact on the lives of everyone, including slaves, and shaped their experiences within these societies.
Yeah, so we've started to unpack some of the complexities of traditional African slavery. It's a system with its own internal logic, its own hierarchies and even its own possibilities for social mobility. But as we know, the arrival of outside forces would would dramatically alter the trajectory of slavery in Africa.
You're absolutely right. And while the Arab slave trade had been present for centuries, it's the arrival of the Europeans that marks a truly devastating turning point in African history.
Right. But before we get to that, I think it's important to understand the impact of the Arab slave trade on these West African empires. The sources describe early Arab traders engaging in mostly peaceful exchanges of goods, like textiles, horses, and copper for slaves and gold.
Mm-hmm.
Did this trade have a significant impact on these existing systems of slavery?
Well, it definitely led to an increase in the demand for slaves, which certainly had an impact on existing power structures.
Right.
But the sources emphasize that initially, this trade didn't lead to the widespread societal disruptions that we'll see later with the Europeans. It was more of an integration into existing economic systems.
Okay. So these empires were already connected to broader trade networks across the continent and beyond. They weren't isolated societies cut off from the rest of the world.
Precisely. And that's a really important point to keep in mind, because it challenges this common misconception that Africa was somehow backward or undeveloped before European contact. These were sophisticated societies with complex trading relationships and cultural exchanges happening long before European involvement.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And it sets the stage for our next discussion, where we'll dive into the arrival of European powers and the devastating impact of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, that's where we'll see a dramatic shift as the demand for slaves skyrockets and the traditional systems of slavery are exploited and ultimately destroyed.
We've been talking about these powerful West African empires, like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, and their complex systems of slavery that existed long before the transatlantic slave trade. But as you mentioned, the arrival of Europeans really changed everything.
It really did, yeah. It's like, comparing a gentle stream to a raging torrent,
Right.
The European demand for slaves was just on a completely different scale.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Massive ships, carrying over 250 slaves each, and with entire fleets making multiple voyages annually.
Yeah.
This insatiable demand led to a level of violence and warfare in Africa that had never been seen before.
So it wasn't just about the number of slaves being taken. It was also about how this demand just completely warped the existing system.
Exactly. African rulers who had previously engaged in more limited forms of conflict were now incentivized to capture more and more slaves to trade for European goods, especially weapons.
Yeah.
It created this vicious cycle of violence and exploitation that really ripped apart the social fabric of these societies.
The sources paint a pretty horrifying picture of this period. They talk about traditional customs being eroded and this complete disregard for human life taking hold.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking to read these accounts. One of the sources actually describes the Kingdom of Benin before and during the European slave trade.
Okay.
And it's a stark contrast.
Right.
Before European involvement, Benin was known for its art, its sophisticated political system, and its relatively peaceful way of life. But once the Europeans arrived, everything changed.
Right.
Warfare became rampant, and the society descended into chaos as the pursuit of slaves became the primary focus.
It's a stark reminder of the destructive power of greed and how quickly it can corrupt even the most established systems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's important to remember that the impact of the transatlantic slave trade wasn't limited to Africa.
Right.
It also had a profound impact on the Americas.
Right.
Where, millions of Africans were forcibly brought to work on plantations and build the economies of these new colonies.
Right. It's hard to overstate the lasting legacy of this period. It shaped the demographics, the cultures, and the power dynamics of entire continents.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting because while we often associate slavery with Africa, it's crucial to remember that Europe had its own system of forced labor during the same period.
Right.
The sources we're looking at actually draw on Karl Marx's critique of English and French serfdom to illustrate this point.
Right, and that challenges this idea that slavery was somehow unique to Africa.
Exactly. Marx pointed out the brutal treatment of serfs in Europe, the harsh punishments they endured, and their limited rights. And while there were certainly differences between European serfdom and traditional African slavery, the point is that systems of forced labor have existed across cultures and throughout history.
It makes you wonder how history might have unfolded differently if the transatlantic slave trade had never happened. What would these African empires have looked like if they hadn't been subjected to such a devastating level of exploitation?
That's a really profound question.
Yeah.
And it's something I think we should all, ponder.
Yeah.
The transatlantic slave trade was a tragedy of immense proportions, and its impact continues to be felt today. But it's important to remember that Africa's history is about much more than just slavery.
Right. These sources have given us a glimpse into the incredible richness and complexity of African societies before European colonization. We've seen their sophisticated systems of government, their vibrant trade networks, and their unique cultural practices.
And while the transatlantic slave trade cast a long shadow over this history, it's essential that we don't let that overshadow the achievements and resilience of the African people.
It's incredible to think about everything we've learned about these West African empires, their complex social structures, the role of traditional slavery, and the devastating impact of the transatlantic slave trade. It's clear that this period had a profound impact on the trajectory of African history.
Yeah, no doubt. The transatlantic slave trade left an undeniable scar on the continent. Disrupted social structures, economies, and cultural practices. I mean, it's a wound that continues to heal even centuries later.
As we've been discussing all this, it's hard not to feel a sense of sadness and outrage, of the injustices that were inflicted upon African societies. But at the same time, I'm also struck by the incredible resilience of the African people. They didn't simply succumb to these external forces. They resisted, they adapted, and they preserved their cultural identities in the face of unimaginable adversity.
Yeah, that's a really important point to emphasize. Too often, I think the narrative focuses solely on the negative impacts of colonialism and the slave trade, overlooking the agency and achievements of African societies. Despite the immense challenges they faced, they found ways to maintain their traditions, their art, their music, and their spiritual beliefs. It's a testament to the strength and the enduring spirit of the African people.
Thinking back to our discussion about the Dian Sandi, the chiefs of slaves who held significant power within these empires, it's clear that even within systems of oppression, there were spaces for resistance and agency, and that's something we need to remember when we talk about any historical period. People are not passive recipients of history. They're active participants who shape and reshape their own destinies.
Absolutely, and it's crucial to remember that the transatlantic slave trade, while a devastating chapter in African history, does not define the entirety of the continent's past. Africa has a rich and diverse history that extends back thousands of years, filled with stories of innovation, cultural exchange, and remarkable achievements.
This deep dive has really challenged my own assumptions about African history. I've learned so much about the complexity and sophistication of pre-colonial societies.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, it's something that I think we all need to be more aware of. We need to move beyond these simplistic narratives that often reduce Africa to a single story of poverty and conflict. There's so much more to discover and appreciate.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's a one key takeaway you want our listener to walk away with?
I'd say this: Africa's history is a tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, of resilience and innovation. It's a history that deserves to be explored and understood in all its complexity.
Yeah.
And it's a history that continues to shape the world we live in today.
Beautifully said. I hope this deep dive has inspired our listener to continue exploring and to seek out diverse perspectives on African history.
Me too. It's a journey of discovery that's well worth taking.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of Africa's untold history. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep questioning the narratives you're presented with.